Good morning, and thank you for attending this a very important event. And I'm particularly grateful to the Division of Diversity and Inclusion, the Heritage College of Osteopathic Medicine, and also to Dr. Lisa Harrison for making this morning possible. I'm proud to welcome Sharon Cooper to Ohio University for today's conversation, this very special conversation. Sharon is a social justice advocate and the sister of the late Sandra Bland, who was found dead in a jail cell in Waller County, Texas on July 13th, 2015, 3 days after being arrested for a minor traffic violation. Sharon today works on behalf of her sister's memory and other Black people who have died in police custody or due to encounters with police. Her work is inspiring, and it's making a positive difference in our country. As you know, our nation is engaged in ongoing dialogue about systemic racism, and we're seeing protests in Athens and around the country. We're also discussing ways to move forward in our collective quest for racial justice and equality. Here at Ohio University, I have joined the many voices calling for Juneteenth to become a federal holiday and to declare racism a public health crisis in our state. Ohio University is also looking at actions we can take on our own campuses. We have much more work to do, and we must work together in order to make real and lasting change. We must honor the legacies of civil rights leaders such as John Lewis and C.T. Vivian, and we must move forward together. As shown by many protests and demonstrations, the scars of racial oppression and discrimination run deep. Ohio University affirms that Black lives matter and strives to be a community that is both inclusive and anti-racist. I call on everyone watching today to join us in embracing the important and ongoing commitment to combating racism. We must use our collective energy to promote dignity and respect for everyone. Education has always been a key driver of social change and progress, and I'm proud of the work our students, faculty, and staff are doing. I hope that today's conversation can help us set the tone for what will be a fall semester unlike any that we've seen before. We remain committed to our core values of diversity and inclusion, especially as we navigate a global pandemic that has disproportionately affected people of color. During these challenging times, today's conversation also reminds us of the power of open dialogue to help us heal, learn, and grow as one Bobcat family. In closing, I'd like to thank our Vice President for Diversity and Inclusion, Dr. Gigi Sakubin, and Dr. Tanisha King Taylor for organizing this important event on our campus. Thank you for the time, and thank you once again to Sharon Cooper for being here with us today. Thank you all for participating, and I appreciate your commitment to doing everything we can to create a better society and more racial equality. Thank you.
Again, thank you, Dr. Nellis, and welcome and good morning, everyone. Near and far, I know we have guests from outside of Ohio University joining us virtually as well, so thank you all for joining us for today's program. As many of you know, I'm Dr. Gigi Sakubin, Vice President for Diversity and Inclusion at Ohio University. It is my sincere privilege to welcome the over 250 attendees to today's event, Black Lives Matter, Examining the Scales of Justice with Sharon Cooper, hosted again, as Dr. Nellis mentioned, by Ohio's Division of Diversity and Inclusion and the Heritage Osteopathic College of Medicine. As we get started, I think it's really important to acknowledge our shared context today. Our efforts to build an inclusive and equitable campus community are now more than ever vitally important and fueled by a global pandemic that has disproportionately impacted communities of color. The weaponizing of law enforcement in peaceful protest, the continued incidents of police brutality towards Black Americans that have resulted in the gross loss of Black lives, as well as the systemic racism that plagues our institutions of higher education, just to mention a few. Now more than ever, it is important for our community to learn, grow, and evolve, to do the work, to examine our culture, and to look critically at our form and functions, our policies and processes. This work will be challenging. As many of you know, we are in for quite a fall semester, but if we are determined, if we are intentional, we can forge a path forward and create a place where we actually emerge as a more inclusive community in equity and social justice work. And this brings us to today's speaker. I wanted to share with you all that I broached this idea with Dr. Taylor very early this summer, with plans to bring Sharon to campus later on this year. As the summer progressed and we all watched in horror as national events unfolded with the deaths of Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and George Floyd, as well as racially charged incidents on our own campus, it became crystal clear that we needed today's talk as a community more than ever. It is now my honor and privilege to introduce our special guest today, Sharon Cooper, who is one of the 4 surviving sisters of Sandra Bland. I personally was able to interact with her early in 2015. She actually came to the University of Illinois campus just 3 months after losing Sandy, and spoke to our campus at a time when, as many of you know, the Black Lives Matter movement was in full swing, and it helped to really galvanize the community and campus, reeling from those losses at the time. So we are so excited and thrilled to have her here today, and I want to thank everybody who came out to support and providing the support for today. And so it is my honor and privilege to give a warm Bobcat welcome to Ms. Sharon Cooper.
Thank you.
For the audience, she can see. So.
Yes, yes. So I just first want to start by saying, I think you said, Dr. Gigi, there were about 250 folks on the call with us today. And I just wanted to say thank you so very much to Dr. Nellis, President Nellis, to Dr. Gigi, and to Dr. Tanisha King-Taylor, along with Tammy Tucker, who's going to be giving us a wonderful piece of spoken word later, as well as Dr. Lisa Harrison, who I'll do a fireside chat with. And to all of you, I always say that it's not, I don't take it lightly that in this environment, especially, that you could be anywhere on a Friday and that you're tuning in to a very important conversation, a hard conversation, and also to one that doesn't promise a level of comfort. I am a firm believer in crucial conversations, and the conversations around specifically the need for consistent and ongoing systemic change in this country is one that is nuanced, is filled with a lot of peaks and valleys. And so I feel so fortunate to be able to have a partnership and network with Dr. Taylor and with Dr. Gigi as well, to even be able to spend a little bit of time with you all. So if you will bear with me, I'm going to share my screen here. And try not to share the wrong thing, if you will, so that I can give you all some insight into our roadmap today. So I'm just going to share my PowerPoint presentation. And a thumbs up from my audience will let me know if you all can see it. Wonderful. All right. So I always think it's important for people to understand what we're going to talk about today in the conversation that we're going to attempt to have. I know the flyer talks about having this discussion around examining the scales of justice. And I think that the best way to connect with people on a deep personal level is to tap into your own vulnerability and share your own experience. And so I thought that I would do that with this audience today. Really what I want to take an opportunity to have a conversation about is Black Lives Matter, specifically the origins of Black Lives Matter, with regard to how did we get here today? I think that that's a question that people have been scratching their heads about, trying to figure out. And I think that there are a litany of resources that are available at our disposal to try to get us to understand how we got here, to how we got here, what happened in the past, and where does the outcry and the uproar following the murder of George Floyd, where does that come from? And I think it's important for us to acknowledge that it's so much deeper than George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery and the countless names of other Black women, girls, men, boys, that whose names and faces that we might not know, but the stories that we continue to hear feel eerily familiar to what's happening in 2020. And I also think it's incumbent on us to have a discussion around the impact and perception that media plays into what frames our overall thinking, with regard to specifically social movements, because I think that we stand in a time right now where we're able to see things and consume news at an accelerated rate through all different types of platforms, digital, social, through print, through television. And so I think that that has an indelible mark on how we view and perceive certain situations. And I think it's our responsibility to be conscious consumers in that information that we ingest. And then, if you all will allow me to share a little bit of my own very real personal experience, and to give you all some human context behind what happens to families who are impacted by police brutality specifically, and what happens when the cameras fade away, and what that personal impact is like on family members and loved ones. Because I think that what we're going to need to be able to experience a seismic shift in the way that we connect with one another is the ability to be able to view each other as human. And then, following along after that, before we get to our fireside chat with Dr. Harrison, which I'm very excited about, we'll talk about where you are in your journey and have a very honest conversation with how you are identifying with what's going on in the world, and also to try to provide a blueprint for you to get to the level where you can become. I always tell audiences when I talk to them that I think it's incumbent on us to be an accomplice for change. I know we talk a lot about allyship and being able to try to develop a level of understanding with people, but I always tell folks that allyship is more than a noun, it's a verb. It requires action, and that's where being an accomplice comes into play. Tammy, thank you for the finger snaps. So if I'm actually going to temporarily stop my screen share, because I do want to share with you all, there was a really good, a very good Procter and Gamble commercial following the George Floyd protests that I only recently saw. And I thought that it was so moving, and captured where we are in this moment. And so I thought that I would take the opportunity to play that just a bit.
With inverted tongue, from whence does fulfillment come? When I expel from this mortal shell, we're at death the living know.
So I shared that because I thought it was important to set the tone. I think that we are all have come to join this conversation because we have a very real deep concern with regard to what's happening in the world today. Specifically, I feel like the U.S. is the world stage of sorts, and the world is watching us, rightfully so. And when I initially started having conversations with Dr. Taylor and Dr. Sukuban, we talked about trying to invoke a deeper level of understanding of Black Lives Matter and what it means and what it doesn't mean. And so I think it's important to always be able to understand where an individual is coming from. So I'm going to share a very real, vulnerable moment, honestly, that I don't share often enough because I think it's really important. I think that if you are a historian buff or if you are interested in stories, I think that it's important for people to understand the history from whence they came, or even the history of the demographic and geographical area in which we sit, right? And so for those of us who are US based or historians, there's a very rich and painful history in this country of the relationship and the power dynamics between white people and those who show up as other in this country. I know specifically we're talking about Black Lives Matter today, but I always push myself as someone who views myself as an inclusivity advocate to widen my language when I talk about the exclusion of others. And so I think that if you identify as other and you show up as other in this country, you have a markedly different experience than others do. And specifically when it comes to Black Lives Matter, you know, I think that we think of present day situations like Trayvon Martin, John Crawford, to localize it to the Ohio area. We think of cases like Samuel DuBose, which for those of you who are not very familiar with that case, Samuel was someone who was shot and killed by a University of Cincinnati campus officer during a pretext traffic stop 6 days after Sandy was found dead in police custody after a pretext traffic stop. You have Tamir Rice, which is probably one of the most painful stories and heart-wrenching because you have a 12-year-old boy who was shot while I feel like merely existing and doing something that kids do, which is playing with a toy gun. There are scores and scores and scores of present day stories that put Black Lives Matter in the driver's seat as the centripetal force that really is at its core a rallying cry to be seen, heard, and valued. That is my view of Black Lives Matter present day. And it is just to say that as a Black woman living in this country, married to a Black man, and the mom to a young Black daughter who is going to be someone's boss one day because she has quite the personality and drive combined of myself and my husband. It is a rallying cry to say that we exist, we should be seen, we should be heard, we should be valued, and we should be treated with common decency. So we're having that conversation in 2020, years and years and years, well over 50 years after the death of Emmett Till. And for those who are not familiar with Emmett Till's story, Emmett Till was a Chicagoan, a young Black boy who typically visited his family in the South. And he visited his family in the South the summer of 1955 and was allegedly accused of whistling at a white woman in a grocery store. And unfortunately, the punitive reaction to him perceived to have whistled at her in the store was his life. And so as a 15-year-old boy, he was found, he was lynched, he was brutally murdered, and left in a river to be found days later. And the strength of his mother, Mamie Till Mobley, to really have him come back to Chicago and for her to open his casket to the world to show the amount of pain and the amount of hatred that existed in this country, all rooted in the fact that there's a difference in skin tone, not a difference in character, not a difference in the lived experiences or a finite issue that someone has with you, but the difference is rooted in the color of your skin. And so you are perceived to be inferior. And so I know we spend a lot of our time now focusing on the present day issues that are happening, but it's incumbent of us to understand that Black Lives Matter has always been a rallying cry for Black women, men, girls, and boys who live in this country, who live under this persistent cloak of fear that when they encounter anyone, not just a police officer, but their fellow man or woman or neighbor or what have you, that they will be perceived by the color of their skin and the stereotypes that are intrinsically tied to that versus someone getting to know them on a very personal level. And so for me, my point of vulnerability in the Black Lives Matter movement is, I'll be very honest with you, the death of Trayvon Martin was, I'm being super open, was a blip on my personal radar. And the reason for that was because I'd become a new mom. And so I was sleep deprived. Dr. Gigi is nodding because she's likely had this experience because she is a mother, as well as I know others are on the call. So I was really sleep deprived and just thinking, hearing about it, I was keeping up with it in the news. And even when the trial occurred, I was still sleep deprived. And I was outraged about it. And so that happened in 2012, and George Zimmerman, who, while not a law enforcement official, was an everyday citizen, right, who took it upon himself to execute on the law, you know, based off of what he deemed appropriate and necessary, standing his ground because he was scared and he felt threatened. And so I fast forward to so George Zimmerman is not charged. He is acquitted of all charges, despite the fact that Trayvon Martin's mother and his brother and his family lost someone that they loved and cared about deeply. And that was where Black Lives Matter was born. Black Lives Matter was born out of a response and reaction to the disdain and the disappointment that many in this country have felt for far too long, which is that there is a disproportionate impact on Black citizens in this country and how they're perceived and valued. And so fast forward to June of 2015, another case, and there were cases even in between 2012 and 2015 that persistently happened, that came into our lexicon, that came into our homes through TV screens and things of that nature. Fast forward to 2015, Walter Scott in South Carolina is pulled over for a busted taillight, I believe. He's got some outstanding warrants for child support, which, let me just acknowledge, I'm sure that there are others who live in different skin who have those same outstanding warrants. But there's a finite difference in the way that we criminalize Black bodies more so than white counterparts. And so to that end, Walter Scott is running away from the police officer who stops him out of actual real raw fear, because there are so many historical receipts of Black lives not mattering, of them not holding the same value as their white counterparts. And unfortunately, he also loses his life, is shot in the back. And I'm in my bathroom overhearing this on the news. And I think to myself, and I am acknowledging that I am not proud of this thought that I had. I think to myself, I am so glad that I am not a mom to a Black son. And I say this with the knowledge that I know Dr. Taylor has a Black son. I believe Dr. Gigi has a Black son as well. And so in my mind, even though we connect as mothers, I think to myself that I'm so glad that I don't have a Black son, because Black women and girls clearly aren't having these experiences because they're not covered as much. And that was 3 weeks before my sister was stopped for failing to use her turn signal to signal that she was switching lanes, which is something that I think we can all acknowledge that we do on this call every day. And every time I see someone do it, I have a moment. We refer to it as the triggers, right? I have a moment where I just think about my sister, and I think about my sister died for what I see countless people do every single day, right? So in that moment, losing my sister was my wake-up call. And so I take you all through this kind of timeline, if you will, these origins to present day timeline, because I think it's important for us to understand that the responses that we've seen to George Floyd's very visceral, very open and outright murder, right? The response that we saw to Ahmaud Arbery's death and lynching, 21st century lynching, and secondarily, the ongoing cries for justice and accountability that we see with regard to Breonna Taylor, who died in between Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd, and yet the people responsible for her death, the police officers who negligently executed a no-knock warrant, are still not arrested, not accounted for. Yes, one has lost their job, but they're still living their everyday lives, right? So all of the responses to that are rooted in the very painful experiences and the historical contours of the denigration and all-out exclusion of Black lives in this country. So when you take a step back and when you try to put the pieces together and ask yourself, what is this Black Lives Matter? What is it all about? Why is everybody so up in arms about it? It's because there is this thing called being exhausted, being outright fatigued and outraged that the world refuses to see you in the same contours as it does your white brother or sister who lives next door to you. The fact that the world refuses to see you as a mother, as a father, as a son, as a daughter, as a business professional, right? I use all of these examples because we consistently see that no matter the role that a Black person plays in their life, they are rendered invisible by their race every single time they're encountered. And so what Black Lives Matter is an all-out rallying call and demand to be seen, to be heard, to be valued, and to be given the same rights, the same civil liberties, the same freedoms that this Constitution that we hold up with such great pride, and we say everybody was created equal, but we know that the everyday lived experiences that others around us are having is not indicative of those rights that we've laid out all those years ago. And the fact that there continues to be this unwillingness to examine the inconsistencies of that document against the everyday lived experiences that people are having, that in turn is why you see the rallying cries for Black Lives Matter. And it doesn't just matter in the contours of, I don't box us into police brutality, because I think it's important for us to call out that Ahmaud Arbery was killed by someone like a citizen, a non-badge holding citizen. There are people who are consistently killed by non-badge holding citizens who are vigilantes, who want to mete out and execute what they deem is lawful based off of existing behavior that they see, that has been deemed appropriate by those who are even in power, right? So I think it's important for us to understand that while state-sanctioned violence is center stage, when we say Black Lives Matter, and I'm going to jump back to the slide because I think it is so important, Black children matter, Black futures matter, and that centripetal force in the middle of Black Lives Matter is if we don't find a way to respond with intentionality in this watershed moment, then that has residual impacts on Black children and the futures, not only just their futures, but the futures of Black women and men in this country and around the world, honestly. So I think I think that visuals are powerful, and so I just wanted to share a little bit of data because I know that sometimes people connect more deeply to data than they do to words and experiences. I do want to take a moment to call out a resource called crowdsource.org, which offers very, very great visuals. I just actually screen grabbed this information off of those for this presentation to give you a little bit of insight into the amount of demonstrations with regard to Black Lives Matter that has transpired since 2014, which I think that we can all acknowledge that that has changed significantly in the wake of George Floyd's death, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery, because even in the midst of a global pandemic, you have folks who've decided that what is happening in this country is too grave for them to sit still and shelter in place. So I know I read somewhere that Black Lives Matter, the protests that happened in response to George Floyd and the subsequent deaths, they happened on an international scale, which was really the first time that we'd seen that in any movement from a global perspective. And so I think it's important to just call your attention to not only just the amount of demonstrations, but the fatal shootings that we see, and of the amount of victims that we see, how many of those folks identify as Black, and what some of the activity it is that we see from law enforcement officials who are at the core sworn to serve and protect. And I think it's also important to call out that this data is a bit outdated, right? Like it calls out 2014, 2015. It even goes all the way through to 2017 in some instances. And I think it's important to note that the instances that we're seeing of Black people losing their lives due to state-sanctioned violence, it's happening so much that it's hard to even keep up with the data, right? Like that's how glaringly concerning it is, the space that we live in this country, right? I think about even post George Floyd, hearing of several other incidents where people lost their lives due to just fatal encounters with police. Rayshard Brooks stands out to me as an example that happened after George Floyd. And there are countless other names and stories that we could talk about on this call. I also think, though, and it's not to be dismissive of those situations or stories, I want to charge you all. If you hear me name drop someone or make reference to something that you don't know much about, write it down, and be best friends with Google for the next couple of days and really, really do the work, right? Because a huge part of social advocacy is having good context and knowledge, right? So I think it's incumbent on you to do that work and to familiarize yourselves with those stories so that you understand that there are names, humans, people, families behind the irreversible hashtags. But I did want to share this infographic because I thought it was really powerful in terms of mapping state-sanctioned violence and why we're seeing such an outcry for a difference and a change in the way that we connect with each other on a human communal based level. And again, want to make sure that I call out that it's not just rooted in police brutality and state-sanctioned violence. That's center stage right now, but there's a deeper call for us to find a way to peel back the layers on the different ways that we show up in life and find a way to connect and on a common level. And I would argue that the way that we can connect on a common level is with the acknowledgement that we're all human, and we are all due the same rights and civil liberties as everyone, right? And so if we can anchor ourselves in that, then that is what helps you start to put together the pieces behind where do I fit then in this narrative. And I also think it's incumbent to call out as well. Someone said to me recently, I was doing an interview and they asked me, how do you feel about Black Lives Matter in spite of all of the criticism that it's received? And my response to that person, and what I'll share with this group for those of you who struggle with every single bullet point or stance that Black Lives Matter takes is you don't have to agree with every single thing that a movement lays out. However, social movements are not erected to make you feel comfortable. Social movements are erected to make people feel uncomfortable because we have aligned ourselves to a status quo. We have aligned ourselves to a way of living and a way of being. And when anyone operates outside of that, they are penalized in a way that is detrimental to their ability to live with the human decency that we all deserve. So I challenge you primarily to get really, really comfortable with your responsibility as in the consumer of information. Like your responsibility as a consumer is to understand what's factual, what's truth, what's accurate versus what's just opinion, which will definitely lead us into the secondary discussion around the impact of media and the role that plays on shaping public opinion. But I want you to understand that social movements are erected because they are an outcry for change. They are an outcry for us to show up and respond differently in life because we haven't done so. And to that decree, that means that it's had an adverse impact on the way that people are able to live their lives and to show up as their full selves. So that's a lot. There's a lot of images there, I know. And they're there to really drive home the point of mainstream media and where we get our news. You know, I try to think about where I used to get my news growing up as a young girl, even coming into adulthood in terms of where I get it now. And I would venture to say, and those of you that are on the Zoom with me, raise your hand if you get your news mostly from social media. You're scrolling through your Instagram, your Facebook, your Twitter. Dr. Gigi's like, no, I don't have time for these things. I have too much work. But I would venture those that are tuned into the call, you consume a lot of information. You consume a ton of information about what is transpiring, what's factual, what should I believe, what's opinion-based. And so I do think that it's important to have this conversation around things that are viewed as illegal or criminal don't necessarily equate to it being unethical and immoral, right? Like, I think we need to talk about the importance of narrative control and perception, right? There are power exists to be challenged, right? And we've been able to watch and to have a front row seat to how the consumption of media shapes our public opinion and perception, right? And so I think that the responsibility that the mainstream media plays, I view the mainstream media's responsibility is to give us information, right? Unfortunately, the information that we receive comes through a different lens. And so to that degree, that starts to shape our opinion about what's happening publicly. And so I want to encourage you in the media that you consume for you to think. And my acronym is it true? Is it helpful? Is it informative? Is it necessary? And is it kind? And I know it seems so basic, but that is really the lens that I operate through when I am consuming media. And I'm also always asking myself, what's the ulterior motive? What's the hidden agenda? And it's not to, I know that a lot of us have this feeling like, oh, the media is negative and it's bad. It has its pros and cons. I just think it's important for us to take a pause and call out the fact that a lot of how we are feeling and what we are responding to, is it rooted in how the media has led you to feel, or is it rooted in how you personally feel about an issue? And I think Black Lives Matter is one of those issues that could be easily perceived as a political movement and a rage against the machine, if you will, when again, if you don't take anything from my conversation, I don't want you to forget that Black Lives Matter is a rallying cry to be seen, to be heard, to be valued, and to be respected with the common decency and civil liberties that are promised to every single individual in this country, even if they're here illegally. That's a conversation for another day that I could take a whole detour on, but I won't. I will keep myself focused.
We'll bring you back for that one, Sharon. We'll bring you back for that one.
Yes, yes. So I do always give this, I give this disclaimer. I believe the next slide will show some very, what I want to say. It's a trigger warning. They're not the most pleasing images, it's not too detrimental, but it's all slides related to my experience and my family's experience with the media in the face of tragedy. Because I want to be able now to tap into that human perspective and take you all beyond the headlines a little bit to give you a little bit of insight into what families experience. And it's my hope. Yes, I know you and I have never met each other one-to-one, but the intimate, dedicated time that we're spending today means that you know me now. You can say we've spent the afternoon together. So it's my hope, again, that that will tap into the human connection. And I want to be able to provide some context on, you know, the things that we see in the media following these very traumatic events and how that shapes or distorts public opinion, you know, the residual impact that it has on family members, right? And then also just to try to open your eyes a bit to, as we get to the space of trying to identify, like, where am I on my journey, and where do I fit into and plug into all of this? So I'm sharing this with you all because I think that it is incredibly important. I would never share any other images in the media from other families that have been impacted by this because I don't innately know their stories. But I'm sharing this with you because I am a lot of things. I'm a business professional by day. I am married to my college sweetheart, who I'm not sure why he puts up with me but he does, so thank goodness. I am a mom to a tiny human. I'm in a bunch of organizations, and I'm also Sandra Bland's sister. I am one of her sisters, and so I share this with you to share that these are the types of things that are out there on the internet for public consumption. And for what happens when you lose your loved one in a very traumatic way, how the public begins to shape their narrative and perception about an individual, and how mostly individuals who live in Black and brown bodies are criminalized and rarely, if ever, given the benefit of the doubt and being described as human before they are described as criminal. And that immediately plants a seed for you in your mental Rolodex and begins to shape your opinion, not just about that individual, but if we're being honest, it begins to shape your opinion about Black Lives Matter, right? And I also would very much like to say, out of respect for my family, for those that are watching, please don't take photos of this or cross share it anywhere. You can reference it if you post about it on social media in terms of the impact that it had on you, but please don't cross share it anywhere. So I just want to point out some things to drive home the point of why Black Lives matters. So Sandra, we call her Sandy affectionately in my family. Sandy was stopped for failing to signal a lane change. Unfortunately, she was assaulted in the field and brutalized by Brian Encinia, who is now a former police officer, not arrested though, but former police officer. And I think it's important to highlight, I think the thing that's the most hurtful for me, and I'll just point my mouse here, is this is an actual image that's out on the internet that's available for public consumption and that also shapes public opinion. The documents that you're looking at here are copies of her autopsy, which was provided by the medical examiner to the media. Another super hurtful image here is this is an autopsy photo, which she is deceased at this point, right? If you Google and search Sandra Bland's name today, a lot of what will pop up is this mugshot photo here, which I very rarely use the word hate, but I disdain and hate that photo so much because it's not reflective of the totality of who she was as a person. There's an article here that's very misleading. A lot of the content in the headline is not factual. And then there is all of these pictures that you're seeing here and here and here, they're all from her autopsy, right? So I share this as a pause. I'm going to pause because I just want that to like sink in for a moment for you to like take in the images. So I'm sharing this with you all because I think it's important for us to understand that when you see hashtags trending, you're meeting those people at the end of their life. You're not meeting them in the full scope of who they were. You're meeting them at the end of their life. And so to that degree, what that's doing is that's impacting and shaping your public opinion if you get your news from one source, right? And so I think it's important for us to consistently question and ask ourselves, not why do Black Lives matter, but the inverse of why don't they matter, right? Because when you take a step back and when you ask yourself that question, it's my hope that you will scratch your head and be confused and befuddled as to why it takes the deaths of hundreds and if I'm being honest, thousands at this point, right? If we include the historical contours of the Black American experience in this country, the death of hundreds of thousands of Black men, women, boys, and girls, and the rallying cries of Black Lives Matter for us to, in 2020, still be beating the drum and asking for that same level of respect, right? I know that there are many of you who likely have lost someone that you love near and dear to you, whether it be immediate family member or otherwise. And so I challenge you to ask yourself, is it fair? Is it fair for the world to attack my loved one in this way? Is it fair for my loved one's autopsy to be publicly available for consumption? Is it fair for families time and time again to have to share their grief with the public and to really have to hold and piece themselves together at a very, very critical, very unexpected time? And so I'm in a position, and it's never been easy, right? But I'm in a position to be able to shed light on that for people. And I do it with a great deal of purpose and intent to help you all understand that before Sandra Bland was a hashtag, before Trayvon Martin was a hashtag, before Rekia Boyd was a hashtag, and before Breonna Taylor was a hashtag, they were at their core, they belong to people. They belong to their families. They belong to their villages. And so when we take a step back and just look at it through a human lens, then we have to ask ourselves, what role am I playing in the systemic denigration of rendering Black lives invisible? Or the inverse, which I am very hopeful that we're all asking ourselves, is if I'm not doing more, what more could I be doing to amplify the stories of the unheard, the unseen, and the undervalued? I also want to take a moment to reiterate the power of social media. I am someone who pre-Sandy considered myself to be, I call myself a couch advocate. I would text a lot or like reshare or post things. And that felt like enough for me at the time. And then I gradually got to a point where I felt like I wasn't doing enough. And so my sharing in this document is really to help you all understand that we know that social media is a gift and a curse. That much we do know. We know that it could be used for good, and we know that it could be used in a spiteful and hateful way. So my challenge for you all and those who are dialed into the call, as we start to think about what are some of my action items and what can I do to be a part of this broader conversation around Black Lives Matter and really demanding, inclusivity and things of that nature. It is being conscious of your social media presence, right? And understanding that if you're going to utilize social media to amplify stories of the unseen, unheard, and undervalued, that you do it in a way that's thoughtful, that's intellectually vocal. And I always take the time to share with people that I firmly believe, I sometimes call Sandra's case the people's case, because so much of the support that we as a family received during that time period was rooted in people caring enough who didn't even know her, people caring enough on social media, people caring enough to write letters, to send emails, to demand justice and accountability on behalf of her, because they'd seen far too many cases that went unheard or unaddressed, right? So I've shared some metrics here and some key highlights, if you will, because these are things that I don't believe would have transpired if people hadn't really moved themselves to action by posting or tweeting or sending emails or things of that nature. And it really does. If you're doing that on behalf of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, or so many other cases that are happening, or instances, if you will, I want to encourage you to keep doing that because even though you don't see the impact that you're having, it makes a very real marked difference in the experiences of the loved ones who've lost their lives. So I am feeling like I've gone over time a little bit. So I do want to try to encapsulate this discussion into a very hot button question that I think that a lot of people are asking themselves, which is explicitly, where are you in your journey towards not just anti-racism, but social advocacy overall, right? I think that for a significant period of time, there were folks who were in the primary three buckets here, which are awareness, sympathy, and empathy, right? So I call what has transpired in these last couple of months the well overdue social uprising that this country has needed for quite some time. Dr. Taylor is shaking her head in agreement. And so I think that there's a know about it phase where people are now aware, and what immediately follows after that is being sad and pained about it. There's a level of sympathy and empathy, if you will, that goes hand in hand when you hear about racial injustice. But my rallying call and my action to those of you that are on the phone today and joining us virtually is I really want to have this broader discussion around how do you move from this place of awareness, sympathy, and empathy to reflection in working your way towards unwavering anti-racist behavior to become a part of the solution, right? In homage to Rep. John Lewis, I have made it my personal mission to get in good trouble. And I'll give you all a little bit of insight into what I feel getting into good trouble looks like, and how you can attempt to move from that sympathy, empathy, and awareness stage more so to the reflection and anti-racist phase. So leadership is a cornerstone of who I am as a business professional, as a person. And so I'm always trying to look for ways to encourage people to lead, even when you don't view yourself as a leader, because we all have a role to play. So it is my charge to those of you that are listening on this call, and as you look at where you might be in this journey, I do think that what is going to be critical in us having a significant change and bending the arc on the injustices that people are experiencing in this country, specifically Black Americans at the moment, is finding a way to lead with our hearts. So much, I think, that we find ourselves on the receiving end of overthinking things. And so for me, when I talk about leading with heart, the leading with heart starts with listening. It is such a fundamental principle and difficult for people to actually execute on. So anytime I come to a conversation, I will ask the person that I'm talking to two questions. What is my role in this conversation? Is it to be an active listener, which means you talk less and you listen more? Or is it for me to provide you with solutions? And for those who are a part of this call and who are feeling like, I don't even know where to begin with allyship, I don't know what to do, sometimes you got to start by just listening and seeking to understand the experiences that people are having, even if you don't live in their skin and you're not having their lived experiences. Because it's only when you listen are you able to develop that deep human connection and understand. And I've often felt that if someone is listening, that is the equivalent of seeking to understand. And that's a basic principle, right? And the E really does stand for empathize, right? I talk a lot about, and I know those that are on this call who show up as others, so many people have said to them, there's no way I could like possibly understand what you're feeling. And I leave you with this tidbit of trying to connect with someone who is Black or someone who shows up as other. COVID-19 has rendered us all like has immobilized us, right? Like there was a point in time, and unfortunately, I think there's another time coming based off of the way our cases are rising, that we all had to shelter in place, right? You have this massive virus out there that is scary and it's invisible, but the impact of the virus is real. We have this very real
Looks like we may have lost her, so we'll wait a couple of minutes and see if she's able to jump back on. Okay, so she has informed me that there was a slight technical difficulty and she is rejoining now. So she should be back on shortly. As we wait for her to kind of rejoin and wrap up her actual talk, a reminder that the fireside chat with Sharon and Dr. Harrison will follow the talk that's given. We'll likely take a few minutes of a break to give her and us some time to recoup, likely 3 to 5 minutes after Sharon ends her overall talk to transition into the chat.
I did want to say thank you to everybody that registered and submitted a question too. So we were able to get through most of those questions, and I know we're not going to be able to answer all of them today, but we're going to get through as many as we can. So thank you to Dr. Taylor and Dr. Harrison for helping to facilitate that. Appreciate you all.
Technology is the gift that keeps giving. Okay, guys, I'm back.
I'm so glad to have you back. Hi. And then we're sharing names again too there, but I think they know the difference at this point that you're you and I'm me. So that's fine too.
We didn't have any break music, Sharon. So
Right. The wonderful
We got to give that
COVID and
feedback
working
on Zoom.
virtually.
Oh. Okay, guys, I'm going to get us over the finish line. Okay. So we talked about leading with heart, listening more than you talk, from an empathy perspective, trying to develop a level of understanding and similarity with understanding what people are going through. I think that the biggest silver lining, in my opinion, about COVID is that it's happening to everyone. It's not just happening to one person. And I think it's important to note that this virus that became top of knowledge for us, I would say over the last 6 months or so, has single-handedly rendered everybody fearful for their loved ones, fearful for the way that they live, the way that they operate on a day-to-day basis. It has really changed the way that your flow of life. And I just want to take a moment to make that connection, that that type of fear that people live with, fear of going outside, fear of gathering, fear of the loss of a loved one because of something you can't see. That is actually the very real fear that Black Americans live with every single day in this country. From the moment they leave their homes, they are consumed with the thought, I would say now more so than ever, because of what we continue to see happening in our country in 2020 of all years. And I say that because I think that there is and continues to be a perception that we're living in this post-racial society. And while I think that that is, it's a thought, it's a wishful thought. So to that degree, I think it's important, if you can take a moment to draw those parallels between, while you may not show up as a Black American in this country, that the fear that you've been crippled with in the midst of COVID is the fear that Black Americans live with in this country every single day. And this fear of, even though the difference, I would say, between COVID being this, invisible virus, is that racism is very visible with very real tangible outcomes and impact, right? So when you try to tap into this empathetic space, try to think deeply about the impact that COVID has had on you personally, and you can easily transform that into the experience that Black people are having in this country, in terms of the fear that they live with every single day, that the people that they love and care about may not come home, not because of COVID and the dangers of contracting that, despite, admittedly, to President Nellis's point, that we are having an adverse impact in our community, but because being Black in America is like surviving an infinite pandemic, without a shadow of a doubt, based off of the experiences that we have every day. And the A in leadership stands for acting with intentionality. I think at the core, everyone that we intercept has an experience and a story. And so I think it's really our responsibility to try to unpack and figure out what those stories are. Specifically, what are the different lived experiences that that others are having, and how can we seek to understand that and have that inform the way that we show up as an advocate on their behalf, right? Because, as we saw from the Procter & Gamble video, there is power and privilege that those of the majority have, that we who identify as others, specifically as Black Americans, that we don't have the opportunity to tap into or to access, just based off of the historical contours and years of systemic oppression and discrimination. And finally, I would say, in the way that you try to show up and lead as an advocate, is to really demand inclusivity in all facets of the human experience. Again, police brutality and state-sanctioned violence is center stage, and I believe, unfortunately, that it will continue to be center stage until we see not just lip service on the changes that need to occur, but actual tangible outcomes and real action. And so while that is center stage, there are also very real concerns and disparate differences in housing, in education, in employment for those who live in Black and Brown communities and occupy those spaces. And so that inclusivity that I think is important of demanding, it has to be inclusive and not exclusive to a particular cause, right? I always tell people, don't be selective in your outrage, be intentional and demand inclusivity along the way. So despite technological differences, again, biggest takeaway that I hope that you'll take away from this discussion today, and we can certainly talk more into the ins and outs of Sandy's case in particular when we get to Q&A, because I know that there will be some Q&A questions that are tied to that. I specifically, anytime that I get the opportunity to share space with people, is I want people to understand that Black Lives Matter, it's not a political movement. It's also not a hate group for those who have heard it coined and touted as that. Black Lives Matter is and continues to be a rallying call from those who have the lived experiences that the majority doesn't have, to be seen, to be heard, to be valued, and above all, to be respected, to be expounded, and to be lavished, honestly, with the same freedom, rights, and civil liberties as their white counterparts. And it is my hope, and I know it'll come out more in the discussion with Dr. Harrison and Dr. Taylor, it's my hope that the blueprint that we've provided in terms of where you are in your journey, let me be the first person to tell you that I spent quite a bit of time in the awareness, sympathy, and empathy space until my little sister became an irreversible hashtag. So my charge to you as someone who's interested in being a part of the change narrative is making sure that you lead with connecting on just a deep human level and letting that be the impetus that pushes you to reflection and towards anti-racist behavior, activity, and work. And don't allow something traumatic to happen to you to have to push you to that point. I think that there is a collective responsibility that we have to one another from human to human. And it really is to amplify the voices and stories of those who feel that they've been rendered invisible. So with that, I will yield the mic to Dr. Taylor.
Thank you so much, Sharon, for such an amazing job. Absolutely, Tammy's clapping and talking, and through looking through the questions that we got for the chat, it just sounds like you didn't answer them all. So I'm just gonna have to come make up a whole new set of questions just on the fly. So in order to give me some time to do that, what I want to do, and I'll yield to Dr. Sakupin as well if she wants some closing remarks before we go into the chat, is take a few minutes, 3 to 5 minutes, to just collect ourselves, grab water, a restroom break, or whatever you may need in that time before we formally start the chat.
Dr. Taylor, how long did you want? About 5 minutes?
Yeah, I think 5 minutes is sufficient. So about 18 after the hour.
Okay. All right, that sounds good to me. So we'll join us all back at about 12:18. Thanks all.
just one more minute until we officially start our chat here. Hopefully y'all were able to get some water. I went and grabbed my favorite mug. Gigi. It's water, it's not coffee because I can't do coffee after the morning time, but I thought that was an important mug to have right now after that lovely conversation that Sharon led us through. Okay, so I think we are at time to officially engage in some additional dialogue. Like Dr. Skubin said, we were able to obtain a great deal of questions from participants that registered for this event. So we really appreciate you again echoing her sentiments for taking the time out to choose to be thoughtful in your questions that you have for both Sharon and Dr. Harrison. And so as we look to start this conversation, I'm Dr. Tanisha King-Taylor. I currently serve as the Chief Inclusion Officer for the Heritage College of Osteopathic Medicine here at Ohio University. I've been here a little over a year and have thoroughly enjoyed my time and the engagements, both in HCOM, thanks, both in HCOM and with the broader DNI office and all the fabulous and amazing work that that division is doing that really demonstrates some of the tangible, I think, and practical ways that Sharon gave us today in terms of how they show up for the work in an attempt to become an anti-racist culture and community. So I'm thoroughly happy to be here with you all today. And it's a great honor and privilege to be able to moderate a session both with Dr. Harrison, who is a new friend, and with Sharon Cooper, who is a longtime friend. I'm really honored and humbled to be able to do so. And so I want to give Dr. Harrison the floor to introduce herself and tell us a little bit about her prior to us starting the first question in our chat.
Hi, thank you to Gigi and Tanisha for having me here today, and Sharon, who I've grown to know a couple of times before this this session. But yes, my name is Lisa Harrison, Dr. Harrison. I am an associate professor here at Ohio University. This is my 10th year here at the university. I am in middle childhood education. Prior to entering higher education, I was a middle school teacher in my hometown of Brooklyn, New York. So education, K-12 and also higher ed is very near and dear to me. And one of my research interests is also looking at the experiences of Black girls in and out of schools, and also looking at the over-discipline of Black girls in middle school as well. So I'm happy to be here. This is going to be a dynamic, well, try to be a dynamic follow-up to what Sharon and Cooper shared. As you were talking, my text was blowing up with how great, how great you were.
Likewise.
So, the people, you can't see them, but they've been saying great things about you, so.
Double snaps, absolutely. And so I appreciate that, Dr. Harrison. Thanks for introducing yourself and kind of giving us a piece of insight into the work that you're doing. I did not know that it had been 10 years that you have been with OU. And so I need to follow up with you so I can get some insight and advice around navigating spaces. So I'll follow up. So thank you all again for being here. I'm happy to lead this fireside chat. I really enjoyed the depth and breadth, Sharon, of kind of how you took us on a journey, not only your own personal journey, but the journey of what Black Lives Matter has meant even before Black Lives Matter became a hashtag, and even before Black Lives Matter became a movement, a social movement, or a political movement, right? From Emmett Till to president, how those things are really important for us to connect the dots for, and how it goes beyond just the brutality of police and authority and unarmed folk, but how it really relates to gentrification, redlining, and some of the other social injustices that predominantly impact Black folk. And so when we think about higher education institutions, right, if we want to narrow the conversation down a little further, recently sharing with medical students something that you shared here today was that the phrase Black Lives Matter is not necessarily political, it's a human phrase and stance, right? It's a rallying cry for these other things. How can we as a university and a local community continue to engage in that civil discourse and dialogue, both in the classroom and in our diversity and inclusion spaces?
There's Tanisha with the good questions. Okay. I actually prepared, guys, for my questions. So I think, again, every response I give is like rooted in personal experience. So I'll talk through the lens of, so I actually went to PWI, right? Which I know Ohio University is as well. I went to DePaul University in Chicago, and of course didn't see a lot of people who look like me. But part of the reason why I chose that university was specifically for those who are not aware. I know I can't see the people on the call, but if you're from Chi-Town, hey, I'm from Chicago, but live in the Bay Area now. And Chicago itself has a history rooted in social justice movements, right? And Chicago also has a very deep rooted segregative history as well. And so part of the reason why I chose DePaul University is because I knew that they were a university that was committed to social change, and the way that they embedded that in their vision and their principles, right? And so I think I very much appreciate President Nellis joining us on the call earlier to give us this very thoughtful welcome. And so I think that the way that you all can continue that work as a university is really following through on the commitments that you make to students, right? Let me clarify, it's not just students, it's following through on the commitments that you make to students, to faculty and staff. When you say Black Lives Matter, and when you try to engage in this ongoing dialogue, it's a matter of, I know this is an overused word, but I think that it is so important to create safe spaces for people to continue to have these conversations when things are not on fire, figuratively and literally, right? I think it's a matter of creating, these are just some examples, not intended to give you all additional work, but creating crucial conversation circles, right? Having thoughtful dialogue around how what's happening externally in the world is having internal and immediate impact on students, on faculty, on staff. And then what are some of the tangible resources that are available to be able to assist them in navigating through this very, very tricky landscape, if you will. I really think that it's a matter of less around talking the talk and walking the walk. And it's not to say at all that is what the university is doing. I think that when I hear the word talking the talk, that at its core is performative allyship, performative partnership and advocacy, right? And where you move from the space of performative to actual is being an accomplice for change, right? And part of being an accomplice for change is having hard conversations. It is creating spaces for people to engage in that dialogue. And it's not just creating those environments at the university, but also to making sure that that is woven into curriculums and making sure that professors themselves have a deep level of connectivity and understanding of what's going on externally, how it's impacting their students and their peers and their colleagues. And so finding a way to show up in a supportive way, even if they don't like have all of the keys and the tools. I think the biggest thing I would say is not remaining silent or taking a place of complacency or inaction, because I think that is what makes people feel as though there's not a level of care there. So I know it's not, and there's not a one size fits all approach, and there's no checklist, but like the things that resonate for me is creating the space for people to even have the conversations, and then following it up after those conversations with tangible resources, whether it be through books, literature, or actual professionals who specialize in, helping people overcome trauma, helping colleagues have a connective discourse around how what's happening externally is impacting them. And then how do you integrate this into curriculum through an inclusive lens, and having conversations with consultants around how to make that a reality in your space. So those are some of the things that I think that if I were at DePaul right now, that those are some of the things that I would see being done based off of my experience there all those years ago, which we won't exactly say because then I would have to reveal how old I am. So but that's...
you're very youthful, ma'am. Very youthful. Dr. Harrison, I know that you do a great deal, obviously, of this work as a faculty member. That's cute. As a faculty member, how do you see not only yourself showing up in the spaces and and attempting to have these crucial dialogues that Sharon mentioned. But how do we kind of build a culture of dialogue around these issues, especially because they've been so politicized? How do we do that on a university campus, and then creating buy-in for it?
Yeah, I think that part of it, you mentioned curriculum. So as a faculty member, that's one of the greatest powers that we have, is the curriculum that we have. And then even looking at the university, we have general education curriculum. So just any student who comes to OU has to take a certain amount of courses. So making sure that when we have these types of requirements, that we're centering diversity as a core component of that. So students have the opportunity to kind of talk and dialogue and learn and address and understand concepts of oppression and anti-oppression, and also joy and genius and contributions, because sometimes we focus so much on oppression, and that's important. Like, we have to do anti-oppressive work, but we also have to realize that we laugh and we have a good time and we contribute all. So the full human dynamic of what it means to be a Black person in America. And then also thinking about, as a faculty member, one of the things that I really think about is we need to incorporate these conversations within our own classrooms, within our own courses, within our own class sessions. But if we do that, we need to make sure that we do the work first. We need to make sure that we educate ourselves so we're not doing more harm than we are doing good. So part of that is educating ourselves with an understanding of racism and oppression. As faculty members, we have several degrees in our discipline, and we spend several years learning about knowledge. And then, research is part of our component. So we also create knowledge as well. And when we teach, I would say the average faculty member spends a significant amount of time thinking about our discipline when we teach. Now, we're spending a significant amount of time on something that we already spent several years studying and practicing. So that same commitment and that same diligence that we take to our own discipline to teach, we also have to engage in some of that work if we're going to do it justice, and do it in a way that, again, is going to be more helpful than harmful. So this isn't to say not to do it because you don't want to do the work. It's just to stand up to the call to make sure that you are addressing your own bias and having your own understanding. So that way, when we engage in these conversations with students, we're able to navigate that discourse, to make it powerful and to make it transformative. I would say another thing is, from the university, is creating a space, not just for students, but also creating that space for faculty to learn, providing professional development for faculty so we can learn and we can grow. So we can have a deep understanding of what we're doing and what we're talking about. And as faculty, also connecting to our larger organizations that we're a part of. I don't know any form of discipline where there isn't a component that relates to diversity. So making sure that intersection of our own discipline that we're doing, that we're teaching, we're connecting to what are the diversity issues inside our own discipline, and to make sure that we're engaging and having those conversations in our classrooms, I think becomes a important component of how do we do this in equitable and meaningful and transformative ways.
That is just all gold, yes. So I really appreciate the framing of that for a number of reasons, because I'm hearing you say a few things in terms of a call to action for faculty and universities as a whole, is to lean into the work, to choose to dedicate and commit yourself to it, just as you have done for the body of knowledge that you're engaged in for the degrees that you got. Mm-hmm. Choose to be uncomfortable with having the conversations in the space, regardless of your fear of having those conversations. And then invest in personal and professional development opportunities for your faculty and staff, so that they are more prepared and adapt to address maybe some of those isms and microaggressions and Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter that are inherently showing up in the classroom space, as opposed to ignoring it, being able to gain that knowledge and being able to lean into it and have those conversations in real time. So that's really critical. And it makes me think about the lack of comfort in the conversations that people are not having in a classroom, and the way in which we've not reacted not only in those spaces but to broader things. And so when Sharon mentioned earlier the murder of George Floyd, the way in which he was murdered was so heinous, which really gave additional rise to the movement. Right, the movement has never ended. It's really important for people to know that it gave additional rise due to the fact of how heinous it was. The heinousness of it, because it was a knee in the neck of a human being that people were actually able to see. So the question that I have for you both is, why did it take such a heinous act when we know from the countless names that Sharon has already shared and the names of those that we didn't speak today, that this has been a continuous happening, and not only from the brutality like Sharon also shared, but across the country in various ways in terms of the oppression of the other group of people, of marginalized groups. These aren't isolated incidents. So why did it take such a heinous act, and how do we continuously keep these conversations in the forefront without other heinous acts occurring?
For me, Dr. Taylor, I think it's really rooted in, I was thinking about this as I was reviewing the questions coming into today. And one of the things that I wrote in my notes is that I really think that shelter in place played a significant role in the why now versus any other time. Not sure, for those that are listening on the call, I'm just going to assume we are all busy, busy, busy. My friends always tell me, we can never get time with you, Sharon, because you're always booked and busy. And I think that for a lot of us in our lives throughout the course of the years, we've been booked and busy and haven't slowed down to really develop a deep human connection with other people. I will be the first to tell you that I prefer a phone call over a text any day, right? Because it gives me the opportunity to deeply connect with somebody, because that's just how I am. So I think it's rooted in the ability to deeply connect with what happened to George Floyd through, again, the consumption of the video, right? For those who did consume the video and who could see it, I just genuinely feel that there was nowhere else for people to go or be, or no appointments to check into, and so you're really faced with really ingesting what happened to George Floyd. I think it's that. And I think it's also too, this thought around the lack of historical knowledge that some have in this country with regard to the foundation upon which we were built, which is slavery. And if we're being very honest, the lack of prioritization that takes in schools, right? It's like a blip. It's a blip in the history books, on people's radars, right? And so what that has allowed is willful turning away, if you will, of history. And we all know the old adage of, if you don't know your history, you're doomed to repeat it, right? So I think that it's this culmination of being able to bring the historical foundation of this country to the forefront through these experiences, and helping people understand the historical origins of the police force, and the fact that it really started out as slave patrol, right? Once you start to share this knowledge with people, they start to connect the dots, right? So I think that it is due to why now. I believe it's due to increased access to knowledge, to actual accurate info. And secondarily, I again believe being in the midst of a pandemic, living with an immense amount of ambiguity and uncertainty, and being in a space to be more open to the stories of others because of this universal experience that we're having. I think that it forced people to pay attention to what is transpiring. And I also do think that videos and cameras are powerful, because what they don't allow you to do? They don't allow you to unsee a thing. That is really what it comes down to. And I think that that's why we had the type of reaction that we had with regard to Ahmaud Arbery, is because there was some video and some footage, right? So I think it's when you are in a space where you can't unsee something, it has an indelible impact on you. And I think that that's why we're having the type of reaction that we are. In addition to the last 8 years, I can't believe that it's been 8 years since Trayvon Martin passed away. But since Trayvon Martin passed away, there has been a big loss every single year. So that's 8 years worth, right? So it was really the calm, and I hate to even call it the calm. It's the chaos before the real storm. I think it's just been building, in the spilling into the streets that we saw from a protest perspective, and even rioting in some cases, right? It's it's the language of the unheard, right? So that's my perspective.
Yeah, and I think it's important that you noted. Oh, go ahead, Dr. Harrison.
I was just connecting it to some of your speech, and you were talking about Emmett Till, and with his death, his mother intentionally had a public funeral with an open casket, so people can see, the heinous crime that happened upon her son. So this notion, even back in the days before social media and mass video, but we understood the power of an image, or the relevance of an image. So now that we have images more readily available, how does that lead to more of the protests that we see happening in this society? And I think everything else you said too was accurate of, we were at a state where everyone was home. I think, the notion of COVID, people are thinking about life in different ways as well. Because death is so around us as well in this conversation. So that possibly, you mentioned empathy as one of your key things of maybe that connects to this notion of empathy as well, where people can see. And then I also think that while people are disconnected, I think people have a value to be connected as well. So being home, people were disconnected. So you might be connected on social media, but you were disconnected from life. So I think having that pause to see the video, to see the time to reflect, and then also this notion of protesting creates this notion of engagement. So wanting to be part of something during a time where everyone feels like they're disconnected as well. I think all of that created this perfect storm of while we're seeing protests, or we're seeing more footage of protests, because we can't forget that protests already exists during this whole time as well. But it's just a more visibility also of the protests that are existing.
Yeah, absolutely. So the inability to unsee the videos, the inability to unsee the images, the additional amount of time that some of us has, because let me tell you, the diversity inclusion folks have been working, okay? There's some people who have some more time, but not everybody. I've been seeing on social media, they're like, what y'all doing with y'all time? Working, what are you doing? So, but I do think that's a critical piece of it, right? You're having additional time to pause and reflect because places aren't open, right? And you're not able to do as much. But I think what's critical that you all consistently are hitting on and going back to is the history of these things and connecting it to the past of slavery and how a lot of these things are really birthed out of these ideological perceptions of people, right? And so when we talk about microaggressions even, those are connected to the deaths of all of these Black and brown people that were unarmed. It's the way in which you are perceived by these people in authority that overtly led to your death. And Dr. Harrison, I know you specifically conduct research that involves studying Black girls and disproportionate school suspension. And some of our questions through participants really centered around state-sanctioned violence. And I wondered how these microaggressions that occur on the macro level, how they really connect to these school suspensions of Black girls, and how do we attempt to find justice for the voices of Black women that aren't heard in these movements?
Yeah, so education, I think any system that you're in, you're going to see this happen. We talk about if you're in the health profession, osteopathic medicine, we think about healthcare. And how does racism unfold in healthcare? How does it unfold in housing? How does it unfold in the criminal justice system? Education, it unfolds as well. And one of the big things that we see in education is is school suspensions and disciplinary practices. So we see that when we're in school, things such as maybe shoving and pushing becomes battery. So we see behaviors that are often behaviors that we will see in any student becomes these criminalized behaviors. And then we get this discourse around the school to prison pipeline as well. So we look at Black girls and we see that they're disproportionately suspended in K-12 school spaces. And when we think about students who are suspended, we think they're more likely to be retained. They're more likely to drop out of school. They're less likely to graduate. They're more likely to be arrested as well. So you see how the actions that takes place in criminalizing and unequitably disciplining Black girls leads to this trajectory of connection to being arrested, or also looking at this notion of being part of the juvenile justice system as well. So part of the conversation that's happening right now is also looking at the roles of school resource officers. And this notion of maybe defunding, which is these parallels you see, because education is a microcosm of society as large anyway. So we see these parallels that are happening. What happens when we have school resource officers in schools? The research says that having school resource officers doesn't make schooling safer. So what happens is we have school resource officers who aren't necessarily trained to work with youth, and they're equipped with a skill set of how to interrogate, how to detain, how to arrest, which doesn't really translate to some of the problems that we see in education system. So looking at, instead of using those funds to support school resource officers, looking at how do we support school counselors? How do we support, have more funding for school social workers? So providing funding in spaces that will really support what we see as problems in school becomes more of a solution to support. And that's just looking at race broadly, even though Black girls are more suspended, that's also looking at Black boys as well. I think particularly when we look at the research with Black girls, we see that part of the issue, and you talked about microaggressions, is that some of the things that Black girls often are suspended for, the research says, are kind of elevated in white boys. So this notion of speaking loud, we cultivate that, of speaking loud, standing up for yourself. We cultivate that and we celebrate that in white boys, but somehow in Black girls, it becomes problematic. They're too loud. And then they get suspended and disciplined for those actions. Mm-hmm. So we need to look also at how racism works, but then also how patriarchy works. Specifically, we're talking about Black girls and Black women as well. So that needs to become part of this discourse. So when we think about the broader mission of Black Lives Matter, we realize that Black lives won't matter until Black women and Black girls' lives matter as well. So part of that needs to be centered in our conversation when we talk about these broader conversations, and also Black trans women as well, because we think about how many deaths have occurred during Pride Month. I believe 6 Black trans women were murdered. Yeah. So we also need to center part of that in our bigger discourse when we talk about Black Lives Matter.
Absolutely, Dr. Harrison. And in a lot of my conversations around microaggressions, I point to the ideology that led to the death of Black and brown folks, and specifically for Sandra Bland. Outside of dying because she failed to signal, she died because she was perceived as an angry Black woman. Right? And that is a microaggression. That is a subtle form of racism, a stereotype that you've assigned to a particular group of people. And because your way of thinking when you approached this Black woman was of that nature, it led to her not returning home. And so I think that's critical to point out in these conversations, because I think people still see it as kind of incidental and kind of these just very overt things. But when we talk about disproportionate school suspension, we can see prisoner pipeline, we see the trail that the ideologies take us through that leads up to these other real heinous acts, and that leads up to the COVID crisis impacting Black folk more that leads up to, right? These other things, but we're framing it and shaping it because it's a microcosm of society, the educational system is. We see the trail and where it takes and how we have much work to do in all of these other systems before we can ever really choose to fix the problem on a larger scale. So I really appreciate you all's thinking through that. We have time for at least one final question, and then I'll lend it to final thoughts of Sharon and Dr. Harrison. We, in this diversity inclusion space, and I know Dr. Sakubin and Tammy can relate, the work is not for the faint of heart in terms of the everyday battles that we engage in order to pursue justice and equity on our institutional levels. And one of the questions that we got from participants was, what can diversity and inclusion folks, as well as allies and white Appalachians, I thought it was really interesting that they chose to specifically name the community in which we're in, and that's really important. What can also white Appalachians do to help Black students that are a part of this community cope in a world that perpetually practices anti-Blackness, especially when we have so much trauma and likely suffer from outrage fatigue?
That's so good. I'm going to let Dr. Harrison go first.
All right. So, yeah, I have a couple of thoughts. Just I want to reiterate this notion of, part of it is not to only talk about oppression. So while we talk about hashtag Black Lives Matter, we also have, if you really listen to the voices of the Black community, particularly if you look at intersectionality too within the community, we have the hashtag Black Girl Magic. We have the hashtag Black Boy Joy. You know, we have Black Genius. So we have these other things that also highlights that part of it is we need to celebrate as well. So part of that is how we help students cope. Part of it is also not tone policing and giving people the full space, the full range to engage in all their feelings and their emotions that they have. Part of it too, this notion of allies, is be a real ally. Right now in my head, so I do pop culture a lot. I was feeling you when you asked about the news from social media, because I do get a lot of my news and information for social media. But Lady Antebellum comes to mind right now, and how problematic Lady Antebellum and their good allyship and their wokeness has decided to use their name, change their name to Lady A, which was a nickname before, even though Lady A was already used by African-American blues and soul singer for, I think, since 1987. And now that they decided, because in their wokeness, they want to be called Lady A, because they're allies now, they're good allies. They decided to, yes, we're going to take this name in spite of a Black woman making her whole livelihood based on this name. And now that she doesn't want to give her name, they're suing her to have this name because in their allyship, they now want to be Lady A. And how problematic of, when we think about allyship, that's not allyship.
Not at all.
Maybe name yourself Lady Antebellum or something, you know, just something that brings attention to why you're changing your name. So I would say part of it is to really think and not prioritize yourself in this notion of allyship. If we're really prioritizing Black people, Black women, then we have to realize that we can't take them down in the process of this allyship. And the other thing you mentioned about Appalachian culture or in our local context is that we also, I think Sharon mentioned this notion of fair earlier, or I think Dr. King might have, both of y'all probably mentioned this notion of fair. And sometimes it seems that we prioritize white discomfort more than Black discomfort. So we have to be willing to also engage in discomfort of having those conversations and making other people feel uncomfortable. People who spill hate and have bigotry, they're comfortable in sharing it. So we also need to be as comfortable in confronting it as they are in sharing it in the ways that we do. And then also, this final thought is, again, going back to what Sharon said, to be an ally, to be anti-racist is action. So as we have these conversations and we learn, we read, this is all part of the process, but it's kind of a basic level of the process. Sometimes we're centering this as the pinnacle, and it's not the pinnacle, it's actually the bottom of what we have. Important work to engage in bias and your own assumptions and your stereotypes, but to be an ally, to be anti-racist is not a belief. It's not a believing in something, it's your action. You know, go back to this notion of a verb. So being willing to actually engage in the action that's necessary to be an ally, I think becomes important. And to realize that you could work within your sphere. You don't have to be big. You don't have to be you. You don't have to do mass transformative stuff. But most likely you probably are in partnership or have a relationship or have a family member that other people don't have access to. So working within your sphere, if everyone worked in their sphere, then things can be completely different as well. So realizing the power that you have with the people who are just directly around you.
You better drop the mic. That absolutely, absolutely on all of that, and being a co-conspirator and not just an ally, right? I think of the example of Bree Newsom climbing up the flag, and the police was going to tase the pole to get her down, but a white man chose to step in and put his hand on the statue because he knew his white male privilege would interrupt the police from doing so. And in that moment, he chose to be a co-conspirator and not just an ally. So when Dr. Harrison talks about action, that's more of a drastic example, but that's what it looks like in terms of using your body, using your voice, using your privilege in various spaces that you're in to influence change. And so now I'll give Dr. Sharon Cooper, and I've just graced you with the title, honey, because so we'll talk about some honoraries later from somewhere. But I'll give you the floor in terms of specifically if you want to speak to that initial question and thought about what can folks do overall from allyship to co-conspirator, but then some things to say mentally sound in the midst of speaking out against racial injustices, right? And untimely passing of folks and the killing of people. How do we care for ourselves? And I know you are all about making sure you're, you know, centered. And so share some of that tidbit with us.
Yes. So I've only spent, I don't know, maybe 2 or 3 calls with Dr. Harrison, and I am a legit fangirl. So I thought the response on, you know, being a co-conspirator and what to do, especially because of how intimately involved you are with the community and the localization of what works there. Total mic drop moment. And so Dr. Taylor, I'm so glad that you asked me the question around staying mentally healthy and sane. I think the one thing I'll say about you know, being a co-conspirator and being an ally, Dr. Harrison, I thought that the example that you used about Lady A was so poignant, and it kind of brings me to, literally reminds me of the black and white photo challenge accepted that's going on social media right now. It's so similar, right? Like the intent of that challenge is rooted in trying to bring awareness to femicide in Turkey. And somehow it has become just like the photos of women empowering women without connecting the context. And I think if there's anything that anyone takes away from this conversation is when you are amplifying and giving voice to others who don't have it, don't exploit them and usurp their stories. Like, don't do that. Stay intimately involved and aligned with the cause and understand what your marching orders are, figurative and literally. And also understand the role that you have to play, right? You know, I think allyship comes with this level of roles in some spaces that I operate in. I am an intentional follower, and I know that because there's someone that's better suited to lead. And so I'm always trying to make sure that I intimately understand what the core tenets are of a particular movement, what the 3-point or maybe 5-point plan is these days, and making sure that I always bring that back to the center. I will utilize myself as an example. Sandy is a name that has become synonymous not just with the Black Lives Matter movement, but the Say Her Name movement. And I make sure that every single chance that I get, Sandy's story has been amplified significantly over the years, and that was through intentionality with our family. But for the stories that I've come to learn of, both of cisgender Black women and transgender Black women, I utilize my platform to amplify those stories, because I'm intimately aware that the thing that they're fighting for the most is for people to know them, and to know that their lives mattered and who they were. So I couldn't agree with Dr. Harrison more on making sure that, you know, in the midst of being an ally and a co-conspirator, that you also make sure that you tie it back to the movement and the cause and purpose that you are speaking out about, because there is nothing more unintentionally offensive than you taking on the identity of a movement that you're trying to support. It's offensive, and unfortunately it breeds a level of trust, and you discredit yourself a bit. And I know that that is never people's intention when they're looking to make a human connection and really be a part of change. Lastly, I live by so many guiding principles in my life, and one of them is making my self-care a P0. Okay, so we talk about priorities all the time. We tend to think that P1 is the most important priority, but when you get to P0, that's the most important one. So for me, I would say, and I would challenge, you know, everybody on this call who's consuming this, especially D&I professionals, you have it from me. Give yourself permission to unplug. Give yourself permission to unplug, to disconnect and disengage, because it is imperative, like your voice in your work and your contributions are critical to moving the needle forward on the movement. There's so many memes I've seen over the years. One of the things that has stuck with me is you can't give from an empty cup, right? And your cup is never going to be able to, you know, overflow and get refilled if you don't recharge yourself. I wrote myself a note because this came up in one of the prep conversations with Dr. Harrison, and I hope that I get it right. Dr. Harrison, I'm probably going to butcher it, but you said something to the, oh, you know what? Yes. Okay. The thing she said that stuck with me was, she said, don't let's not have a limited view of what activism is, right? Activism is multifaceted. And yes, it's about protesting and being out in the streets and writing letters and writing emails and bringing a level of awareness to the atrocities that are going on in the world. But also there's an immense amount of self-care that goes into that. So after this call later today, I'm taking my daughter to the aquarium because that is my happy place. And I just want to spend time with her and have a good time with her and disconnect. And so the amount of grace that we show others, I recommend that people show themselves that, because I tell people that the journey towards social justice and civic change in this country, it is a marathon. It is not a sprint. And I think that because of Law and Order and SVU, we've allowed ourselves to think that the journey towards justice, it happens within 24 hours or within an hour, right? That we consume these TV shows. So the race, I'm getting very biblical, not given to the swift, but to people who can endure. And part of endurance is tapping into self-care in a very unapologetic way,
Thank you so much for that. And I'm cognizant of the time. I have thoroughly on a number of levels enjoyed the conversation. In addition to the overall talk provided by Sharon, I think it was critically important that we had a faculty member and someone with a lived experience and activist that advocates on behalf of these movements, give us context to how we can, both as co-conspirators and folks on collegiate campus in D&I work, really impact our university and local community. So I am positive that the participants here today are going to be able to take back some of those tangible and practical ways. And so I'll turn it over to Dr. Sakubin so that we can have our finale from Tammy Tucker.
Thank you. Thank you all so much again for your time. I want to, as we close today, I want to thank all of you, Ohio University faculty, staff, and students, the Ohio University guests who came today, Athens community, for your support of this event and Ohio's diversity and inclusion efforts. Additionally, I would be remiss to not thank Dr. Nellis and his ongoing commitment to and support of our work in the Division of Diversity and Inclusion throughout campus. I also want to thank the people behind the scenes, which you all weren't able to see all of them, but there was some frantic stuff happening an hour before and then up into the event. So special thanks to Dr. Dwayne Bruce and Pat Bungard from Diversity and Inclusion, Tracy Kitts from OIT and Ryan Chapman from undergraduate admissions for providing technical support and managing the registration for this event. The large-scale Zoom event has a lot more technical components than you may imagine. Also want to thank Sheldon Anders from University Communications and Marketing for creating the beautiful black and yellow marketing materials that really was a reflection. If you all felt like it had some resemblance, it really was inspiration from the Black Lives Matter paintings that are on the streets in DC and in New York. So thank you for that. Finally, I want to thank Dr. Lisa Harrison and Dr. Tanisha King-Taylor for facilitating a wonderfully insightful fireside chat today. And finally, Sharon, thank you so much for being our friend and our guest, and for having the grace to share your story and insights with us, as well as the courage to continue to share Sandy's message with everyone. Because I know telling the story again, it probably feels like the first time you have to share it again. So I am not unaware that that is a difficult story to share, and we appreciate your grace and being able to share that with the Ohio community today. I'm very grateful for that. And so I don't want you all to leave yet, because as Tanisha teased a little bit earlier, we have a special guest here today. Before I have her close things out, I want to share just some closing thoughts with you. And these were shared by Jamila Thompson, who served as Deputy Chief of Staff to Congressman John Lewis, who many of you know witnessed the homegoing celebration yesterday for Congressman Lewis, who is laid to rest. And I feel like these comments are completely in line with what Sharon shared today. So in Jamila Thompson's words, she shared to be kind, be mindful, recognize the dignity and the worth of every human being, be the best version of yourself, be informed, stay engaged, even though this work is hard. If you are of age and eligible, for the love of God, please vote, end quote. And so as we move into the fall semester, the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion continues across the nation and at Ohio University. So these are some clear action steps you can take at 1:15 today that we can all take in our daily lives before we move on to the more difficult work. So now I want to close our event with Tammy Tucker. Many of you know her. She, for those of you who didn't know her, she had the TRIO thing the whole time, which I thought was great. So she's here at TRIO programs here at Ohio University, and she's from Cleveland. She is an educator, a leader, a mother, civil servant. She is also we tend to run to each other in the early mornings on the Athens bike path. She's tending to her own physical health and our own mental stability, so on the bike path. So I also want to share that Tammy shared this poem with me, so gracious, just shortly after George Floyd lost his life on May 25th. She shared this a couple days later, and it was a very poignant poem. And I just really held on to it and promised her at some point, I don't know what that's going to look like, but you're going to have an opportunity to share that. And that is happening today. So I'm so pleased to give Tammy Tucker the floor to close us out today. So thank you, ladies.
Thank you so much. In the book Stamped by Jason Reynolds and Ingrid Kendi, he asks us to take a moment and inhale. He says, take a deep breath. Inhale, blow it out. And in that manner, I bring you Breathing Matters. My first breath was black. My last breath will be black. In between life and death, my soul being matters. In between my first and my last, my love matters. My parents matter. My men, my beautiful Black men matter. Our children matter. Our education matters. Our community, our credit, and our church matters. Our dignity, did you hear me? Our dignity matters. Our contributions toward revelations and revolutions are a part of our persistence. Our theory of resistance is founded in your tradition of fear, consistent, power, maleficent. Squeezing out my song about love? No, you're squeezing out my song about sanity, safety, and sanctity matters. My hurt and loss of people who look like me, talk like me, walk like me, think like me, breathe like me, weep like me, who want the freedom to be just like me, matter. James Kilgore says, my soul has grown deep with want for everyday life not to be an event, for everyday life and every day to go to work and not be a struggle, for every minute of our lives not to be a threat. You see, long before the boats hit the shore in 1619, our collective Black breaths matter. N-O-W, now. Thank you.
Tammy, thank you so much for that. Thank you all for attending here with us today. Thank you, Dr. Safieddine, for your wonderful closing thoughts and quote by that fabulous person. We really appreciate you all taking the time today. You have attended Black Lives Matter, Examining the Scales of Justice, a conversation with Sharon Cooper. We hope that you enjoyed and have a fabulous rest of your day.